set? Okay. Well, hello, and thank you to the Havre University and GUEST-Normandie for bringing me to France, and thank you to all of you for being here with me today. Here we go. For decades, metaphorical connections have been noted between comic book heroes ranging from Superman to the X-Men and the lived reality of LGBTQ people, lesbian, gay, bi, trans, and queer people, navigating the pressures of closeting. Both groups must deceive people closest to them to protect a rigid separation between their two identities, one normative public face and an alter ego developed for fear of social disapproval and legal consequences. Yet the position of LGBTQ people and their legal rights, especially in America, have changed significantly since Superman first transformed himself within the confines of a phone booth in 1941. And with them, the dynamics of closeting have also shifted. Charting the historical evolution of superhero closeting metaphors allows for simultaneous examination of how the social function of closeting changed over time and how audiences have engaged with closeting metaphors differently in various eras. Therefore, this project compares changes in the approach to closeting and secrecy on two very similar CW series, Smallville and The Flash, in order to understand the constant allure of the closeted superhero for very different moments in LGBTQ history. While the time span between Smallville and The Flash may seem relatively minor, changes in law and culture around LGBTQ issues in America, as well as the role of privacy and surveillance in society, have been significant. When Smallville premiered in 2001, consensual same-sex sexual acts were still illegal in many American states. A record number of LGBTQ military personnel were dishonorably discharged from the military under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. The marriage equality fight was in its infancy, and it remained legal in most states to openly discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity in almost all aspects of life, from housing to employment to adoption. In addition, the 9/11 attacks occurred only a month before Smallville's premiere, which meant that the series developed alongside the war on terror and an increased cultural obsession with hidden internal threats and duplicity. Thus, Smallville's metaphors of closeting and secrecy were produced within a culture of hostility towards LGBTQ lifestyles and a more general culture of suspicion for social deviance. While homophobia and institutionalized forms of discrimination certainly had not disappeared by 2014 when The Flash premiered, the framework of struggle had changed dramatically. A series of Supreme Court decisions and policy changes had made same-sex sexual acts and same-sex marriage legal everywhere in America. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a thing of the past, and in many cases, sexual orientation and gender identity had become legally recognized protected classes for the purpose of hate crime and discrimination. However, at the same time, a growing backlash culture now attempts to undo many of these gains, while many authors argue that the stigmatization of LGBTQ populations has simply shifted to other security threats, making terrorists in some ways the new social queers who represent an existential threat of cultural death. At the same time, the ramifications of policies developed during the early years of the war on terror have become apparent, exposing the shocking scope of American intelligence agencies' surveillance both abroad and domestically. The shift from active military engagement abroad in the early years of the war on terror to a strategy largely characterized by intelligence gathering places the Flash within a fundamentally transformed culture, strongly influenced by suspicion about both corporate and government surveillance and modern security politics. As a result, metaphors about closeting and secrecy in The Flash are differently inflected in relation to, on the one hand, modern gains made by the LGBTQ rights movement, and on the other hand, increasing fears associated with pervasive state and corporate surveillance, as well as transformations in security politics towards a necropolitical carceral state inflected by neoliberal capitalism. Although many TV series on the CW structure their plots around keeping and revealing secrets, including Supernatural, Gossip Girl, and Jane the Virgin, The Flash draws upon a rich history of specifically superhero narratives in which secret identities function as a central preoccupation. Superman is often discussed as the origin of this phenomena, as some gay men recall identifying with the way he must rigidly divide his life between a boringly normal day job and a fabulous second self who can only find true expression by night in secret. Although in the original comics Superman rarely changed in a phone booth, that location nevertheless became iconic, and the shape of that confined space for transforming from normal to super also invites association with the closet. As a result, superheroes' struggles with keeping their secret identity and super identities separate and disclosing their identities to others have often been read as a double narrative that expresses a political meaning for audiences able to decode this symbolism. The closeting metaphor also serves as an ideal driver of serialized plots, because as noted by Eve Sedgwick in the Epistemology of the Closet, coming out is an unending process due to the social system that makes certain knowledges unthinkable. No one has to come out as straight or as human, because these are assumed. Yet invisible, non-normative identities must constantly be performed and declared. As a result, the secret identity plot can continue to drive many short and long arcs within a serialized narrative. Oh, I don't know what's happened to us.
Just move. No.
Click, move your.
The pad.
Yeah.
Oh.
Should.
No.
Or press enter.
Press enter.
Yeah.
No.
No.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No problem. Technical moment. Okay. Okay. As a result, the secret identity plot can continue to drive many short and long arcs within a serialized narrative, as the character must come out in stages to each person, social group, and new acquaintance, rebooting the tension leading towards the climactic moment of revelation over and over again. Charting how various superheroes navigate the secret identities and their associated closeting metaphors can thus excavate an implicit form of politics. For example, some, like the uncanny X-Men, draw on closeting metaphors to align their heroes with socially marginalized and oppressed populations, paralleling the discrimination faced by mutants with LGBTQ people, as well as other groups like Jewish people and undocumented immigrants. These structures allow some superhero narratives to examine unjust social hierarchies, internalized oppression and shame, as well as consciousness raising, social justice, political organizing, and solidarity. However, in my 2005 article, Smallville Sexual Symbolism, I argued that closeting and secrecy in Smallville primarily function to reinforce social hierarchy as part of a post-9/11 politics that obsessively policed the homeland for hidden internal threats of moral degeneracy. On Smallville, there are two groups who have powers, Clark and everyone else. Clark is an ideal immigrant, adopted as a baby and socialized in a two-parent Midwestern farm household. This wholesome upbringing sets the moral framework within which he learns to control his naturally evolving abilities. In contrast, at the same time that Clark fell to Earth, a meteor shower of kryptonite also landed with him, and it invaded the Midwestern soil with an alien influence that infected and mutated many of the inhabitants of Smallville. Notably, the powers that develop as a result of this unnatural transformation represent grotesque amplifications of a variety of otherwise fairly average social deviances, often targeted by conservative family values politicians. As a result, Clark vanquishes and often kills a variety of Smallville citizens who represent a threat to the existing social hierarchy, including such terrors as poor kids who study too hard to get into college, ugly girls who want to become pretty, the son of a cancer patient who tries to end the suffering of terminally ill patients, and a gay man exacting revenge on his bashers, and a lesbian who tries to seduce the prom queen. Often these powers developed because the victims were in the midst of breaking social boundaries when the meteor hit. For example, having premarital sex or studying rather than going to a party. The closet functions on Smallville as a way of sequestering shameful powers associated with moral degradation from public view, and having powers is frequently associated with forms of sexual perversity. While Clark uses his natural abilities for quote-unquote good to cleanse the population from the threat posed by citizens overcome by alien influences, he still hides for fear that others may see him as unnatural. As a result, Clark wishes above all else that he could just become normal, represented in Smallville by such things as joining the football team, dating the homecoming queen, and, of course, joining in an annual tradition to tie up a gay boy and crucify him in a cornfield. The need to keep secrets and closet his abilities reinforce the idea that these are shameful aberrations. That Clark goes from becoming the football team's ritual sacrifice in season 1 to a member of the football team in later seasons underscores Smallville's association between normativity, heterosexuality, and goodness, making those who find comfort in the secrecy of the closet both morally suspect and dangerous within this narrative universe. Yet by the time The Flash premiered on the CW in 2014, using a similarly secret-fueled plot structure, the politics of sexuality and secrecy had been significantly transformed since early post-9/11 period by two primary forces. First, the development of a sanitized LGBT politics of assimilation in opposition to the consolidation of a new queer necropolitical outgroup in the figure of the terrorist. and the rapid expansion of extra-legal surveillance and detention, often in conjunction with privatization. These two forces both hinge upon the legal meaning of privacy and the social resignification of the boundaries of normative citizenship to incorporate LGBTQ people who can pass as respectable, while consigning others to a state of exception in which all forms of inhuman violence, confinement, and exploitation become possible. As a result, closeting metaphors take on a very different resonance in The Flash, as sexual perversity no longer functions as the dividing line between normal and abnormal. Instead, citizens are divided from inhuman others on the basis of a privatized, participatory, and datafied system for assessing risk, and consigned to permanent and secret incarceration, which dramatizes the intermingling between biopolitical and necropolitical modes in modern neoliberal security politics. The first significant shift in the politics of secrecy deals with the changing status of LGBTQ people in society and the organization of GLBT politics around respectability and incorporation. Theorist Steve Seidman argues that while queer politics remain anti-normative, the main force of the modern gay rights movement seeks the acceptance of GLBT people precisely on the basis that they are normal and even ideal citizens in every way other than sexuality, a tactic that Lisa Dugan calls homonormativity. Seidman argues that while this strategy has been successful in gaining civil rights for GLBT people, these rights come with two costs: the disavowal of queer and non-conforming members of the LGBTQ population, and a wholesale endorsement of state-sponsored capitalist exploitation, racism, nationalism, and militarism. First, the gay rights movement asks for incorporation within existing state institutions, which are rife with multiple forms of hierarchy, including discrimination based on race, gender, religion, class, and national origin. As a result, the rights gained through the gay rights movement unequally benefit those GLBT people who are already the most privileged. This is most clear in the fight for marriage equality, which leaves behind all those who will not or cannot conform to existing boundaries of marriage in all respects other than sexuality. By prioritizing marriage, the gay rights movement thereby sacrifices and further stigmatizes all of the queer possibilities for living outside of marriage. And indeed, in many states, after the passage of gay marriage, they have removed the option to have other forms of partnership. So it's not gay marriage plus, it's gay marriage or. Secondly, by basing their request for inclusion as full citizens on the premise that GLBT people are ideal citizens, the gay rights movement often invests heavily in nationalism and non-sexuality-based forms of hierarchy, rhetorically making themselves more similar to those at the top of what Lauren Berlant calls the virtue-value scale, and distancing themselves from those at the bottom. This structure is perhaps clearest in the positioning of GLBT people as necessary national resources in the realm of consumerism and military service, gay people as ideal consumers, and particularly in American rhetorics as very good Arabic linguists for some reason. That seems to be the ideal position for gay people in the American military. They're so good with the Arabic. These arguments emphasize the positioning of GLBT people as necessary for the success of the state and reinforces the notion that despite their sexual difference, GLBT people are the same as other citizens in that they love all the right things, namely money, and that they hate all the right things, namely military enemies of the state, which today means terrorists. Seidman notes that these logics create two opposing rhetorics of national belonging and security. One older form focused on internal threats that requires the sexual purity of the state, and a newer strategy that requires the incorporation of some privileged GLBT people in order to shore up failing institutions like marriage and military service, and to nationalize and exploit their resources in the fight against a larger external threat. Smallville's fixation with purity and the perversion of average citizens into grotesque threats to the social order fits within the earlier social structure and enforces closeting as a space of silencing and shame, while in The Flash, sexual identity becomes a wholly unremarkable issue, dwarfed by the spectacular scale of the threat posed by metahuman terrorism, wherein the closeting of sexual identity becomes actually kind of nonsensical. First, unlike in Smallville, having superpowers does not function as a metaphor for sexual perversion on The Flash, and metahumans who end up using their powers, both for good and for evil, show no clear pattern of... Sorry.
Just keep going.
Okay. Show no clear pattern of engaging in deviant or virtuous behavior at the moment of the particle accelerator explosion, which caused the mutations in Central City. We're back. Okay. There we go. The police captain who supervises the Flash's main detective contact, and the Flash himself in his secret identity day job as a crime scene investigator, is also gay. The narrative produces significant tension when a terrorist attack threatens to derail his wedding and widow his partner, which serves three purposes: positioning their relationship as relatable and sympathetic, domesticating gay sexuality within the state-sponsored institution of marriage, and constructing solidarity between this gay couple and all good citizens against terrorism. The chief's gay identity appears completely unremarkable, as no storyline explicitly identifies him as gay or deals with what might be termed gay issues. Instead, his fiancée, then husband, simply appears occasionally as a side character with no fanfare or commentary. Gay citizens in Central City thus seem to fold neatly into the regular functioning of daily life and unproblematically function within state institutions, including the police force. Even the far more anarchic queer sexual potential of various superpowered metahumans is explicitly noted but largely underdeveloped and unremarkable. Their perverse potential poses no particular threat to the social order, especially compared to the need to use their powers against terror threats. Thus, recalling the old man of steel, woman of Kleenex debate, which posited that super strength may require Superman to find queer alternatives to normative heterosexual penetration, characters eventually realize that Barry's super speed may make him orgasm too quickly to please a partner, the implication being that Barry may need to explore other forms of sex, or may need a different kind of same-sex partner, not same as in another man, but same as in another speedster. Similarly, the metahuman hybrid Firestorm could only effectively become a functional person and weapon against terrorism by accepting the queer excesses of his new powers. Created by a fusion of two men in one body, Firestorm could not control his powers or avoid internal combustion until both men fully accepted their fusion with each other. This is partly dramatized in the series by a queer sexual problem, that is, their shared experience of sexual attraction for each other's wife and fiancé, and their acceptance of physical affection with both partners while in the same body. Thus, while they at first nearly cause a nuclear reaction trying to rip themselves in two directions at once, namely towards each of their respective partners, and demonstrate disgust when one of them uses their joint body to kiss their partner, eventually they reach homeostasis partly by accepting their essentially polyamorous relationship. Finally, many of the metahuman terrorists on The Flash also demonstrate queer sexual potentials. Yet, unlike Smallville, in which, for example, a lesbian mutant is killed by impalement, their powers and punishments are not metaphorical extensions of sexual perversion. Therefore, sexual variation does not form a key criterion on The Flash for dividing the population between normal citizens and abnormal threats to the social order, and the closeted space of superhero secrecy cannot stand in for gay shame or suppression. Yet, although it is difficult to argue against the social changes that improve the lives of even a small portion of the GLBT population, these gains come with sharp costs, according to scholars including Seidman, Dugan, and Lee Eidelman. Eidelman uses Lacanian philosophy to argue that because all civilizations in history have died, modern civilizations consolidate the fear of social death in one absolute other, then engage in ritualized forms of sacrifice. By killing members of the outgroup that stands in for an existential threat to the survival of the civilization, modern societies may imagine that they can endlessly stave off their own inevitable end. Eidelman particularly argues that children represent the future, while queer people often represent social death because they have historically been associated with a hedonistic fixation on the present and cannot naturally produce children with each other, and due to their cultural association with the AIDS epidemic. As a result, he argues that the symbolic ritual is enacted in modern societies when the lives, health, security, and happiness of gay people are sacrificed to ensure the idea of safety for children. It's usually not actually safety for children, it's just the idea of it. Yet Eidelman also argues that because some outgroup must symbolize social decay and endure ritual violence, it would actually be unethical for queer people to attempt to alter their social position, since another outgroup would have to take their place. For Eidelman, the only ethical response is to refuse the rehabilitation of queer identity. Yet, given the data and surveillance-driven shifts in society, which will be discussed in a moment, conscious refusal may no longer actually be feasible. At this juncture, J.K. Puar takes up Eidelman's line of reasoning, arguing that the terrorist has been substituted for LGBTQ populations in modern rhetoric. She charts numerous instances wherein GLBT sexuality has been channeled through the marriage quest into a socially respectable form, while terrorist sexuality becomes the new form of perversity. Puar also argues that it is the terrorist who now represents the collective death drive, especially in the figure of the suicide bomber. Following Puar, like the gay death drive, manifested most clearly as barebacking during the AIDS crisis, the terrorist death drive appears as a primal, illogical, and intractable problem. In their book, The Media of Conflict, Tim Allen and Gene Seaton explain that wars are often described by journalists through two lenses, as resource-driven or as the result of primordial hatred. The primordial frame forecloses the possibility of understanding, negotiation, or permanent resolution, leaving genocide as the only inevitable result. The social death drive, imagined either as queer or terrorist, remains equally rhetorically intractable and beyond the realm of logical explanation, leaving only containment and extermination as a solution. Conflicts with metahumans on the Flash model the terrorist mode, while Smallville demonstrates the queer mode. Unlike Smallville, wherein the perverse influence of foreign matter inevitably makes the town's citizens into evil monsters who pollute the body politic with sexual impurity that has to be hidden and closeted, on the Flash, exposure to the particle accelerator explosion merely magnifies what people already were. An inherently good person like Barry will remain good, and inherently bad people who are already engaged in crime and violence will continue to do so, but simply on a larger scale. Metahumans must be contained in the Flash because they commit unpredictable, often illogical, and frequently self-destructive violence against the civilian population of the city. As a result, having something to hide becomes associated on the Flash with terror rather than sexuality. Yet, as noted by Christy Ball, the idea that the innocent have nothing to hide and nothing to fear becomes especially ironic within an era of pervasive state surveillance and datafication, especially for populations that historically have good reason to fear government intrusion and criminalization. This situates closeting and secret identities on the Flash within modern struggles over both private and government spying. Privacy, situated within the constitutional right against unlawful search and seizure, is the legal structure that, in American law, protects citizens from government scrutiny and secures a wide and sometimes strange range of rights, including from abortion to the legalization of gay sex. All of these are considered privacy rights associated with search and seizure. However, as demonstrated by repeated leaks, we now live in a world of shrinking private zones, saturated by constant extra-legal surveillance perpetrated by governments, corporations, and hackers. The common desire to retain a private life yet still take part in public forums now echoes the superheroic struggle to shield one's private life from the dangers inherent to public exposure. These dangers are at least twofold, as emphasized by the constant slew of doppelgangers and impersonators on the Flash, as well as the Reverse Flash's mission to kill Barry's mom upon the discovery of his secret identity. Exposure of identifying details makes one vulnerable to crime, from identity theft to stalking. Yet perhaps even more worrisome, exposure of personal data in an era when mass surveillance is coupled with abstract algorithmic systems for measuring risk, also known as data valence or actuarial surveillance in David Phillips' terms, also entails vulnerability to discrimination and criminalization based on invisible and often unforeseeable correlations. Given enough information, no one's life is completely free from data somehow correlated with risk factors, either those associated with national security or those associated with the denial.
You broke my computer.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm almost done. The denial of services or employment. Some of these risk factors are obvious or well known, including race, religion, and national origin. Yet data valence does not separate people from the population only on the basis of a priori socially defined stigmatized categories, but instead based solely on statistical correlation. As a result, undoing shame and stigma does not matter within a system of data valence, when a data trail full of LGBTQ-oriented reading material may eventually make one ineligible for a blood transfusion based on a hidden algorithmic calculation of risk. As a result, the category of the terrorist and the category of the queer begin to reconverge as targets of risk assessment, according to this new logic. Secrecy and closeting therefore also reemerge, not as a response to shame or stigma, but as tactics for evading data valence based in part on the targeting of non-normative data profiles. Further, within neoliberal capitalism, a large portion of the state security apparatus has been privatized, meaning that the algorithms responsible for dividing the population between acceptable citizens and terror threats are themselves secret and proprietary. Thus, becoming classified as a threat to society cannot be effectively fought, both because the depths of modern fear and loathing for the category of the terrorist, and because algorithmic evidence cannot be questioned or interrogated by the public, not even in a court of law. Therefore, this categorization is unidirectional and places one in a permanent state of exception, outside of the regular operation of law, a concept developed by many critics of the American War on Terror, including Judith Butler and Giorgio Agamben. And this is from an art exhibit dealing with another sort of state of exception, which is undocumented migrants. Reinforcing the alignment of the terrorist with death, Achille Mbembe classifies the state of exception as an exercise in necropolitics. As opposed to Foucault's concept of biopolitics, necropolitics describes the social administration of states of death and decay, and the process by which states divide populations between lives worth cultivating, who are recognized as citizens and subject to laws, and killable populations, consigned to neglect and extermination, beyond the recognition of the law. In modern security politics, this includes practices like extraordinary rendition, drone warfare, and black site prisons, as well as indefinite detention. For instance, the disastrous American drone bombing of a wedding in Daabala in Afghanistan and a Doctors Without Borders bombing in Kunduz helped to reveal that the drone program decision tree consisted largely of correlating metadata. If several sources of metadata statistically tied to a terrorist were geolocated simultaneously, a drone and death would follow. The decision tree that consigned an entire family and hospital to the necropolitical state of exception was almost entirely algorithmic and automated, and thus both irreversible and unaccountable. Even as Doctors Without Borders called the American military during the bombardment to explain the mistake, the bombing continued because the metadata had already placed them in the necropolitical realm and erased the protection of human law. Given the irrevocable, secret, and unpredictable processes that underlie data valence, any form of secrecy may thereby become justifiable in self-defense. The Flash echoes this new neoliberal data and surveillance saturated reality on several fronts. While neither necessarily good nor bad, mutations on the Flash as a result of the particle accelerator explosion change humans into metahumans and forms a potent criteria by which risk can be calculated. This terminology explicitly defines and separates a portion of the population as potentially threatening and different from the normal human population. Even though many metahumans are not violent, their extraordinary powers are often difficult to contain and frequently attract the notice of surveillance. The Flash and his team often use a variety of surveillance technologies to detect and subdue metahumans, including CCTV, facial recognition, and data analysis. Closeting is thereby necessary for metahumans to escape state and private surveillance apparatuses, as a variety of characters attempt to either exterminate or exploit all metahumans. The Flash reflects the too close for comfort relation between private interests, data valence, and necropolitics in at least three ways, emphasizing the stakes of modern closeting and double lives. First, as just mentioned, Barry and the Flash team use state and private surveillance to search and analyze personal data. Yet because they are not acting as direct state functionaries, they do so with no oversight or accountability. Acting as a private contractor, the Flash can thus carry out searches without a warrant. Sorry, one last time. Interrogate suspects with no legal boundaries and collect evidence outside the chain of custody. As a hero of unquestionable goodness, Barry thus normalizes these practices and encourages the acceptance of sweeping, unauthorized access to personal data. Yet at the same time, Barry's own powers, it's okay. There we are. Barry's own powers place him in an unusual position. He often relies on surveillance to identify, locate, and capture other metahumans, but his own speed is a power perfectly attuned to the surveillance era. When he runs through a crime scene and zooms away with a captured villain, all he leaves behind on surveillance footage is a flash. His powers thus act as a form of data valence closeting that allow him to maintain a secret identity, while at the same time they make him the perfect proxy state functionary who can work in absolute secret beyond the boundaries of the law without leaving a trace. Secondly, the Flash also depicts the privatization of participatory forms of surveillance, exemplified by Iris. The only time the Flash becomes vulnerable to surveillance is due to the ubiquity of citizen surveillance in the form of Iris's cell phone. She later becomes a professional journalist based solely on her cell pictures and amateur blog, chronicling her personal investigation of the Flash. Iris thus represents what Anders Albrechtsland calls the diffusion of state surveillance via social media and participatory production of data for state and private analysis. Finally, the Flash also dramatizes the end of the necropolitical process, as the metahumans Barry identifies as a threat either end up killed or indefinitely detained in solitary confinement within the Star Lab's secret private prison with no charges and no legal recourse. As with terror suspects, the Flash provides a similar rationale. The particularly heinous nature of metahuman crimes and the extraordinary security threat they pose means that both terrorists and metahumans cannot be contained by ordinary prisons or legal processes. As the DA notes, the court system simply is not prepared to handle threats of this magnitude. The Flash underscores the categorically inhuman nature of the metahumans' crimes by explaining that they will all be released when they can biologically transform back into regular humans. Their crimes and inhuman necropolitical status are thus inextricably entwined. Therefore, in some secrecy and closeting metaphors on the Flash explore a fundamentally different set of political contingencies than those constructed by Smallville. While Clark Kent sought the protection of the closet because he felt ashamed of his potentially perverse powers and tried desperately to mature into a normal heterosexual adult, on the Flash, neither powers nor sexuality are inherently shameful. Yet Barry Allen still hides his powers from a much more extensive net of state and private surveillance, in which publicly revealed data can become a deadly destiny. Paradoxically, he also uses his surveillance-defying powers to capture and contain other metahumans within a secret and unaccountable private form of indefinite incarceration. Each superhero narrative thus dramatizes the anxieties and contradictions of post-9/11 security politics, yet within a social and legal structure transformed by changes in LGBTQ rights and the algorithmic administration of life and death. Thank you.
Thank you so much.